So welcome to the book launch we're going to be doing for my friend Joe Rigney here. The name of the book is The Things of Earth. It's basically just a list of all the things of Earth, straight through, alphabetical, not super exciting. No, it's actually a very engaging book. Seriously, Joe, how long have you been here?
10 years.
10 years, me too, 10 years. And over the course of 10 years in any church culture, what you begin to find is that every church culture has its strengths and its weaknesses. There's no perfect church. There's no perfect church culture. And our church, because we are full of passion, full of zeal for the glory of God, for the glory of Christ, we also have strong, big-time, intense strengths, and with that, some pretty intense blind spots. And this book, The Things of Earth, I think Joe has gone a really long way and a really thorough way in demonstrating some of our church blind spots, the weaknesses that not only he's seen, but he's really experienced on a very existential level for the last 10 years since he's been here. But Joe, why don't you give us a little 10,000-foot flyover of the book, and then once we do that, what we're going to do is have basically a Q&A. I'll ask Joe a few questions, and then we'll be taking questions along the way. So even as he's about to give you an overview of the book, we have a hashtag. It's a new thing in the world. It's a hashtag that if you put the little pound sign next to a certain phrase, then you can share it with other people. So the hashtag is Things of Earth. Hashtag Things of Earth.
On Twitter.
On Twitter, yeah. Sorry, I don't really know much about technology. I'm just say these things. It's on Twitter and hashtag Things of Earth. So if you have a question, you can write down your question on Twitter with a hashtag Things of Earth, and it'll come right up here to this iPad, and I'll scroll through and decide whether it's a good question. And then maybe I'll ask it to Joe.
Maybe I'll answer it.
Yep. Okay. So why don't you give us a little...
Yeah. So let me give you a little bit of kind of the origin, and then I'll do the flyover. So I became a Christian hedonist in college. I think I'd actually become one prior to that in high school, not knowing that that's what had happened. I'm pretty sure it was the Psalms that did it. You delight yourself in the Lord as the deer pants for streams of water. Those were the sort of prayers I was praying kind of as a senior in high school into college. And somewhere in there, somebody said, "Hey, you should listen to this Piper guy." I said, "Great, I didn't even know you could listen to sermons on the internet." That was a new thing for me. But I did, and it resonated at a very deep level. And so I got all kinds of hyphenated words. I was God-centered, Christ-exalting, Bible-saturated, and everything. You just kept adding to the list, and I was good to go. And so I dove headlong into that and found it to be unbelievably eye-opening as I opened the Bible in new ways and was seeing new things there. And that the mission statement that we all love here at Bethlehem, we exist to spread a passion for the supremacy of God in all things, for the joy of all peoples, through Jesus Christ. That was it. That was what I wanted to be about. And so college was pretty sweet in some ways because it was a very deep, rich time of exploring the Bible with help from Pastor John and then those that Pastor John kind of introduced me to, old dead guys by and large. And so it was good. It was hard. There were some seasons of doubt and depression that kind of sobered me up from that young Calvinist stage that too many of us have gone through. But all is good. So then after college, my wife and I moved up here to be a part of the apprenticeship. And as we did, we just really wanted to see what does a church look like that's built on that kind of foundation, God-centered, Christ-exalting, Bible-saturated, missions-driven, so on and so forth. What does that actually look like in practice? And it's been an unbelievable season for us here, 10 years at Bethlehem, seeing that fleshed out in so many different ways, with some of you, in fact. But through it, like Matt said, there's been some things, some funky things that have kind of emerged both in my own life. Marriage causes all that. There's a great old quote, something like, "Marriage is the great searchlight turned on the darkest corners of your soul." And that's true. So things began to emerge in marriage. Things began to emerge as we were here at Bethlehem. That began to feel not right. Something was a little off. Like this passion for the supremacy of God was going in funny directions in my heart, and I wasn't sure how to resolve it. And so a couple of things happened that helped to resolve it, and is where the book came from. The first was when I was at the Bethlehem Institute, now Bethlehem College and Seminary. I took a class on Jonathan Edwards, and that class was like in the same way that in college, Pastor John had opened up my eyes to a whole different world than I'd been aware of prior to it. This was that kind of same, like it happened again. I didn't know it could happen again. And it's happened a couple of different times since then as well. So Edwards' Trinitarian vision of life, the deep, rich view of God-entranced vision of all things that he embraced was so big and was actually deeper than I'd thought. I hadn't really connected the Trinitarian aspect. And so I've got a chapter in here on the Trinity largely because of that, because I thought I'd missed that, or the fullness of that, or how important that was until then, and that blew it open in new ways. So that was one thing, is this class on Edwards that began to make me think there's ways of thinking about God's passion for his glory beyond even what I'd conceived. Second thing that happened is I started reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, and I started reading a lot of Doug Wilson. And both of those, so there's the influences. I joke in the book that there's 4 streams that come down to water the garden that became this book. One of them outside, all from one source, that's God, but Piper, Edwards, Lewis, Wilson. And that it was the combination of those things over the past probably 5 or 6 years that really began to collect into what came out here. So from Wilson, there was this real earthiness to the way that he writes about things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but there's real earthiness, and that I began to think like that's a little different than what I feel like I'm used to, but it feels like it fits. I got to figure out how it fits. Mm-hmm. And the same thing that happened with Lewis. There was aspects of Lewis that I had never considered before. And so through that, some of these questions like, how do I enjoy my wife, now my kids, my food in such a way that I'm really enjoying them, that I'm not just kind of using them in some kind of means-end way, that they're not really important, and I'm really enjoying God and that's it. How do I really engage with them in such a way that it's honoring to God, but really engaging with them? Like I felt like I was always being pulled in these 2 different directions. And I felt like because of my God-centeredness, because I embraced that, thought that was biblical, my default was always to feel like if I'm doing this, things are good. Any pull this way felt guilt. And there was just kind of this vague sense of guilt in engaging with anything that was delightful. And so the things like, I feel like I might be enjoying fill in the blank, my wife, my kids, football, too much. Mm-hmm. And it was that too much. Like, what does that mean? Like, there was no concrete definition to that. It was just, I'm enjoying this too much. And if you try to push into that and you say, well, how would you know if you were enjoying it just right? Kind of like three bears, it was too hot, too cold, just right. How do I know just right? And I couldn't answer that question. And so I began to think maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm asking that question. So it's questions like that. It was questions given my finitude, given the fact that I have to sleep, how are you God-centered all the time? How can you be God-centered all the time? How can you do everything to the glory of God? What does that actually look like on the ground? So it's questions like that, and as they began to come together, a couple years ago, I had the privilege of kind of moderating a discussion between Piper and Wilson at a Desiring God conference, and trying to explore this. I was like, you guys are on the same page on so many things, and yet I feel like there's some differences. Let's explore that. And so as I'm doing that, all of a sudden I began to think like, there it is. That's that thing that's been missing. And it was through that little interview, out of that, basically I walked out of that session. It was a couple hours of fun theological conversation. I had a blast doing it. But I came out of it saying, I think that there's a book here on how do we treasure God in the enjoyment of his gifts. And so then one of the great things about being a church-based college and seminary is that you get opportunities to try stuff out. And so I got a chance to teach through basically the content for the book 3 different times over the course of a couple of years. And through that, met some of you and who were saying, yeah, me too. Me too. That's how I feel. I feel that guilt. I feel that stretch that I'm not sure. I feel like I'm holding my created goods, these gifts, like a hot potato. Like I don't want them to get too precious to me. And there can be these weird dislocations in families as you're never quite engaging fully with each other because you don't want to become too precious. What if God takes them? Mm-hmm. And I don't want them to be too in here, because if God decides in his providence to do a Job on me, I don't want to curse him, and so I won't let things get close. So there was things like that as we talked here at Bethlehem that I was like, okay, and it was good. There was a lot of refining that happened through that, and so those are just some of the things, So it's been a real sweet thing over the past few years to be here at Bethlehem, to experience the grace that God's poured out here, and then to think, I think that we can press forward. And so with that, what actually is the book? So I'm going to actually open the table of contents because this will jog it. So I start where we ought to start, which is with the glory of the triune God. We start with God, and he creates in order to draw us into fellowship with himself. And that's what I didn't get prior. I'd always thought of God as he exists to display his glory, but I didn't realize that display of his glory was actually an invitation. Like, come in, join us. And that's where the Trinity came in. It's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, knowing each other, loving each other, delighting each other. Come into this. Come enjoy this eternal fellowship that we've had, and we don't need you, but out of joy we've created you, and we want to invite you in. And that was kind of a different picture in my mind, and all of a sudden, different other elements of created life began to make more sense. Like, that's what marriage is about. That's what families are about. That's what churches are about, are little pictures, little examples of that kind of triune fellowship. So I start there. God exists, or God glorifies himself by inviting us into his fellowship. Then I move from there and talk about the author and his story. How does God relate to creation? Well, he's the author. This is his story. The world is his story. We're his characters. And part of the reason I put that in is because authors and characters are so closely related that you can't quite set, like, who killed the White Witch? Well, Aslan killed the White Witch. Well, but who killed the White Witch? C.S. Lewis killed the White Witch. And so there's a way that the author can be involved and engaged in doing things within his story, and yet his characters be really active in that story. And that began to think, like, that might be how God's engaging with all sorts of things in this world he's made. And so from there, it's creation is communication, that God is, Edwards says, the world is filled with images of divine things. Images of divine things, pictures of spiritual realities. That's what the entire world is made up of. God revealing himself. Heavens declare the glory of God, and so does everything else. And so are we listening? Are we paying attention? Can we recognize him in all of these different ways that he reveals himself? And so that's a fun chapter. Lewis at one point says that every pleasure has the potential to be a tiny theophany. A theophany means revelation of God. Every pleasure can be a tiny theophany. And so that gets explored. Then jump from there to we're creatures. We're temporal. We live in time. We're bodily. We have bodies. We're not angels. And that God thinks that bodies and time are good ideas. And therefore, any guilt that we feel because we can't do everything all at once, or because we're bound in these bodies that need food and sleep and drink and all these other things, that's not a defect. God thinks that's good. And so kind of drawn on Genesis and trying to draw that out. And that God is the God of yes, that God says to Adam and Eve, eat from every tree. They're all for you. There's one no, but eat from every tree. And so he's a lavish God. He loves to give good gifts to his children. From there, it jumps to, the big question that emerges at that point is, well, what about the fall? What about sin? Doesn't that wreck stuff? And that's where we really kind of, it becomes, that's where it gets real, because most of us are very attuned to the danger of idolatry, at least in our circles, right? Like, we don't want to commit idolatry. And so how does the gospel deal with it? What is idolatry, and how does the gospel deal with it? And so there's a chapter on that. And then from there, it gets real practical. So there's this kind of deep foundation that just kind of sinks way down into salvation and the Trinity and sovereignty of God and revelation and all that kind of stuff. And then out of that, building on that, comes these chapters about rhythms of Godwardness. How do we, you say grace before the meal, and then you enjoy the meal. And then maybe you say thank you for the meal afterward too. But there's these rhythms to our lives where we go directly to God, and then we come back down and engage with horizontally with the world around us. And that God intends, that's a divinely designed rhythm of we worship on the Lord's Day on Sunday, and then we live our lives during the week seeking to do kingdom things there. Then talk about culture. Does culture work the same way as creation? It's one thing to enjoy nature. Basically what happened was, as I was writing the book, all of my illustrations were either my children, my wife, or food. Mm-hmm. That's what I like. And so I began to think, like, one question people are going to ask is, what about movies? What about books? What about music? Can you enjoy those things in the way you're talking about to the glory of God? Does that work too? And so I have a chapter on culture that maybe we can get into. And then I give some illustrations and examples from my life, little snapshots. And then here's where the real fruit of being at Bethlehem came out. There's 3 chapters towards the end that were basically owing to the fact that I have Pastor John in my ear in a really good way. Because it'd be really easy to write a book about enjoying all the good gifts God richly provides us with everything to enjoy, and for people to hear that and think what you're talking about is health, wealth, prosperity stuff. That's what that sounds like. Enjoy all the good things. Just accumulate. Pull them in. Enjoy them, because it's all about God, right? It's just a way of enjoying God. And so I had things like, what about self-denial, ringing in my ears the entire time. I had conversations with Pastor John through the writing of the book, and he would say, what are you going to say when the baby dies? And I said, I hadn't thought about what I would say. I should think about that. So there were some really sweet things about being at this particular church, in this particular environment where self-denial, what about generosity? You start talking about how you can enjoy your food. Should you enjoy really, really fine food all the time because that's the best way to glorify God in the enjoyment of his gifts? What about generosity? What about missions? And so those kind of questions were front and center, and I knew I couldn't write a book about treasuring God by enjoying his gifts without addressing those. So I try to tackle self-denial and generosity and missions head on, and in the process, talk a little bit autobiographically about the ways that the wartime lifestyle, which all of you, I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with wartime. Life is war, therefore all of our resources should be strategically used. We should think about what's the front, where should we devote our resources, how do we send them to the front? And I had embraced that wartime lifestyle in college, and I think it went wrong in my heart. I think something goofy happened in there, something sinful happened, and the way that wartime was lived out for a number of years wasn't godly. It was actually sinful. Well-intentioned, I was trying to honor God, but it wasn't actually honoring to God. And so there's a chapter on that, and then a chapter on suffering and death. Like, what do you do if you're talking about how do we enjoy these things for God's sake? What do you do when they're taken away? And again, one of just the providential things that if I had to choose, I would say I'd rather not have this have happened. I mean, in other words, this was not something I would have chosen, but my dad died a year ago after about 7 years fighting Alzheimer's. And so kind of in the middle of this process, here's this man that I deeply love, and I'm losing him, and I'm watching him die. And then he dies in the middle of writing this book. And so it's like, okay, yeah, what it's not now the question wasn't mainly, what are you going to say when the baby dies? It's, what are you going to say when your dad dies, Joe? What are you going to say about losing that precious gift? And it was really fruitful for me to have to answer that question for myself and to walk in suffering or through suffering with others in this church who've gone through things that are even worse than that, and to be able to say, God's still good in this, and you should press into the gifts and not, hold them at arm's length out of fear that that might be too painful if they get taken. And so that's so there's the overvw. Start deep foundations and then begin to get more practical as it goes along. So that's a long answer, probably longer than we thought, but.
No, I think that's all the time we had. No, well, I love the book for 3 reasons, and probably about 20 more, but here are 3. 1, it gave me the nudge I needed to quit the paleo diet. You talk enough about pumpkin crunch cake, man. 2, I told Joe this earlier, but maybe this is a selfish reason, but the books that I love are the books that seem to, let's say, they seem to put feet on, articulation to the things that I've been feeling for a long period of time. I don't know if you guys resonate with that, but when you read a book and you realize, I haven't put comprehensive thought into or comprehensive articulation to these things that I've felt on a gut level for a long period of time. And I think especially in our culture, this book does that really well. And then the third thing is it's extremely thorough in answering objections. So we're in Bethlehem culture. This book you could look at it and go, whoa, 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 this is way too horizontal for Bethlehem culture. But and Pastor John testifies to this in the foreword. Maybe if you want the book just because Pastor John does the foreword, that'd be good. But he talks so much about the thoroughness of your biblical treatment and the answering all the objections. I was like, I'm reading the book thinking, here's another question I have, but by the time I got to the end of the book, it was answered.
Right.
And I think that was really helpful. But what we want to do for the next few minutes is basically Joe and I are going to have a conversation, not scripted, I'm just going to ask him some questions about things in the book, and hopefully you can begin to feel some of the same things I have about putting feet on, putting words to some of the things that you're feeling and resonating with. And then as we go, we can scroll down and get the Things of Earth hashtag questions working. There's one so far. The one before that, the hashtag said 2.5 pounds flank steak, marinated, broiled, and glazed with caramelized soy sauce and syrup, hashtag Things of Earth.
That's right.
So if you want to put your recipes on there, that's fine too.
That's right.
So yeah, I'll ask a question.
Okay.
And we'll get moving. You do mention food quite a bit in the book. Lots and lots. It's Pavlov's dogs type of thing. And one of the big deals we live in the city, urbanites, and you have a big old thing, food fuss. It's like all the different dietary trends. I just talked about paleo and, Whole 30 or Whole 9 or part, 80-20 and all that stuff. And then there's gluten, and everything else. So you talk about pumpkin crunch cake like 15 times in the book.
Yeah.
That is gluten full.
Yeah.
So how do you think about the food fuss movement when it comes to promoting the things of earth, especially food?
Yeah. So this is actually, it's really interesting because in the handful of times that I did the seminar here, and when I've talked about it to other people, it's been a little bit surprising to me. I guess I just don't get out enough. How often that kind of question comes up, and we got an email about it as well about just what do you do about food guilt, and I was like, what's that? I've never experienced this. Describe it for me. And so basically what it sounds like is that in certain contexts, and I think we're in one of them, there are foods that begin to be treated as first they're undesirable. Maybe we don't like them because of taste, or they might be unhealthy. We might think that they're not good for us in some, that they're not going to promote our, bodily health to the degree.
Processed,
yeah, right. Processed foods or genetically modified or whatever. And that gradually over time, those categories harden to where there actually becomes kind of an immoral element to this. And that people can feel guilty if they partake of them, or make other people feel guilty if they see them partaking. So you get kind of funny looks if you're giving your kids McDonald's, or you're coming to church and you didn't have time, and so you just zip through the drive-through and you bring McDonald's to church and you're getting looks from people, and you begin to think like, oh no, they think I'm feeding poison to my kids, and so it's that sort of thing. And so as I've talked with people about it, I've gotten increasingly concerned about it, to be really honest with you. Because I think it's really, really dangerous. So let me just try to break it down a little bit. On the one hand, you might look at something like that and say, oh, we have Bible verses that deal with this directly. Like this is a weaker brother, stronger brother issue, right? Some people can eat meat, some people can't. Some people can eat gluten, some people can't. And we're not talking about allergies. So bracket off allergies. Maybe I'll come back to that. But bracket off allergies. This is just, it doesn't make me feel good, or I've read something and they said it was bad or something like that. And so stronger brothers, those who are free to eat, ought to bear with the failings of the weak and abstain from gluten when you're around those folks. I think that would be one impulse that you could have, would be love would say, I'm going to give up gluten because it offends their conscience, or they might feel like it's sin for them. I think that there's a right impulse there to want to love other people and make room for them. The thing that makes me feel a little bit funny about it is, like in 1 Corinthians, when Paul's talking that way about stronger and weaker brother, he's talking into a context in which for thousands of years, God had said, don't eat those foods. You cannot eat food sacrificed to idols. You can't buy that food from the meat market. You must prepare your food certain ways. And so God had sort of mandated this during the Old Covenant era as a way of separating the Jews from the Gentiles. And then Jesus comes, declares all food's clean, and now it's, all bets are off. And there's people, though, who are trying to navigate these new waters after. So that's a pretty big, transition. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that part of what Paul's saying is let's be patient with folks who aren't getting there, who don't recognize that the earth is the Lord's and all of its fullness. So don't raise any questions about the meat that's sold in the market. Just say thank you and eat it. And so there's a redemptive historical context kind of element here that I'm not sure quite translates to the 21st century. So maybe think about it this way: like if in the Bible we had restricted food laws which give way to all foods are clean, This is us moving the other direction, where we've got all foods are clean, everything's good, enjoy it, and then all of a sudden, for other reasons, like it's been modified or it's got gluten or whatever, now we're going to start to wall off and say anything that has this amount of high fructose corn syrup or gluten or whatever, those things are the bad kind of foods, and we're gonna wall it off. So that feels like we're moving the opposite direction. That feels like all of a sudden, instead of being in a weaker brother, stronger brother, bear with one another kind of situation, we're in more of a Paul confronting the Judaizers situation, right? Standing up to Peter and saying, you're withdrawing from those people because you think they're unclean? I'm going to oppose you to your face. And so you're not eating certain foods because you think that they're not healthy? Well, I mean, the Bible's clear on this sort of stuff. One of the verses I spend a lot of time on is 1 Timothy chapter 4, 1-5, where Paul says, everything created by God is good. Nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving because it's sanctified by the word and prayer. Everything's good. Nothing's to be rejected, genetically modified or otherwise, gluten or not. Everything's to be received. In fact, he goes so far to say that the people who require abstinence from foods are succumbing to the teaching of demons. Now, when you got Paul the Apostle saying that what you're requiring is demonic, you got to feel a little bit of danger there. And so, again, this is not something that I've personally ever dealt with. Food guilt's not my deal. But as I've heard about it, I begin to worry in precisely those directions that we are erecting standards about what we eat, and that those standards become barriers to fellowship. And so maybe just like, so 1 Corinthians says, food does not commend us to God. We're not better off because we do eat. We're not better off because we abstain. That kind of principle ought to sink way down when it comes to food. Food does not commend us. You're not better off because you eat organic strawberries. And you're not worse off because you eat a Big Mac. Or better off because you eat a Big Mac, right? Food's not the issue. The issue is fellowship. The kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but righteousness, joy, and peace in the Holy Spirit. That's what the kingdom's about. And so anything that would drive a wedge there, like any scruples about food that would drive a wedge there, I think is contrary to kingdom, contrary to fellowship, contrary to gospel. And so maybe just so Pharisaical food fussing, I think, is an increasing issue. I think there's a cultural element to it coming from outside the church about fearing what they fear. And I would be willing to bet that there are probably people, maybe even here tonight or maybe here who are watching this later, who ought to repent of erecting barriers to fellowship based on food, and that bearing fruit in keeping with repentance would look something like going and getting McDonald's tomorrow. Right? Like, okay, I've been doing this. Now I'm going to go have a Big Mac in repentance, and I don't even know if I'm half joking.
Quarter joking.
I'm a quarter joking,
yeah.
Right? Like I'm really actually almost serious about it. Like if I was talking to someone face to face, I'd say, I think what we need to do right now is go enjoy some kind of big greasy burger together, and you need to do it with a happy heart. And if you can't, then I think there's a real problem. Now, having said all that, there is real issues with food allergies. If I eat that, it's going to put me in the hospital, or even just food preferences. Like there's all kinds of foods I don't like. Right, raw onions, you can keep them. I'll share. I'm very generous when it comes to raw onions. I don't drink coffee.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you can have my coffee and raw onions.
I like neither of those.
Yeah, and so there's food preferences, but I look at that and just say, more for everybody else, God bless you. And that's what 1 Corinthians 10 is really all about, right? With that passage that we always quote, whether you eat or whether you drink or whatever you do everything to the glory of God. The point of that passage isn't mainly it applies, how do you drink orange juice to the glory of God? But the main point is, don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles. Don't let food become a barrier to fellowship. In a marriage, in a family, in a church, don't let food ever be an issue. Eat and drink to his glory. So that's a longer answer, but sure. I think, and there may be follow-ups, you guys can tweet them at it. So.
Yeah, a little follow-up here. So 2 thoughts. One, let's say you got a mom who, in her family, she decides, I'm going to make my own cereal, and et cetera, and I'm only going to use the green onions from the garden. And so she establishes standards within the family.
Yep.
That the one thought, well, I'll just ask this so you can give a brief answer on this. How do you think of that mom who I mean, is this more of a Romans 14 reality, or would you say, no, this is still stepping into, I mean, let's say the kids go over to their friend's house and their friends, my friend Ben Lucas, 6 years old, man, my mom used to make my own cereal, my cereal. And so I went to Ben Lucas's house and opened the cabinet, and he had Rice Krispie treats and like Kudos bars with a chocolate cover. Yeah. And I was like, I've never seen anything like this. But in our family, it's like, okay, if you're at Ben Lucas's, you can do it. But what about a mom who says, let's pass on that?
So I think that the issue would come down to how do you talk about it with your own kids? So if you have rules like if you go over to their house, you can't have certain foods, you run the risk of creating a barrier to fellowship there, I think, with the mom who doesn't have the same standards you do. I think in terms of your own choices, we buy organic produce and stuff like that at our house, and we think it tastes better sometimes. Like that's the sort of it's a preference thing. And I've talked to Yia here, the guy who does all the cooking, and he's basically said 75-80% of good food is just good ingredients, and so getting quality ingredients is how you make good food. And as you read, I like good food, and so in terms of just in our house, we're just going to have all natural stuff, and we're going to do stuff in the garden. I think that's great. Lord bless you. If you go over to somebody else's house, and we're not talking about actual food allergy, like it would put you in the hospital or you would be, on the couch in a coma afterward, but just, preference. You go over to somebody else's house and they bust out, the non-organic stuff and they're offering it to you. I think for you to make an issue of that and to refuse to eat because of that, I think would be a sin. Yeah. I think that you would be saying, food's more important to me than you are. Right. Than your hospitality, than your graciousness. And so I'd say that's a sin. Okay. And I think the place where actually I think it becomes trickier in that kind of scenario is actually between husbands and wives, because I think, at least anecdotally, the way I hear it, is oftentimes it's moms who often are the nutritionists for the family, and that's a great role for them. Like a lot of moms really love that, and I've been blessed. My wife's great at this, at just thinking about how do we have good food at our house. And so, but we're on the same page about how to think about it. Whereas if you have a situation where a mom gets really gung-ho about gluten-free, and then you got a husband who's like, I was raised on like Wonder Bread, Jiffy peanut butter, and like, strawberry jelly that was laced with, high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah, lifespan's about 45.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
And he's like, I turned out okay. And I think there's a real danger there that all of a sudden food's going to really harm a marriage. And so that's why I think those texts, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Timothy 4, those kind of texts, like getting those into your bones. Mark 7, Jesus said all foods are clean, and saying whatever else is true, that's true. Now let's make decisions out of that about how we eat, what we eat. That ought to be the pervasive kind of environment. Yeah,
there's one other factor that I think we had talked about this before, but there's the haughtiness factor or the cool factor that fits in here when I think about it, because it's like there's one factor that's elevated, you're saying, is love. This is what you see elevated in 1 Corinthians 10 and Romans 14. It's like you love, and people are more important than food. And then with that, I think there's what I observe is a haughtiness factor, that it's like we're going to figure out some sort of outside of me standard to erect and say, this is a platform I can stand on that you can't stand on, is that I don't eat those kinds of foods.
And that can work both ways. It can be we don't eat gluten, and that makes it, and that there's a moral superiority there, or we do, and we're gonna kind of rub it in your nose. Watch me eat my Big Mac, and I'm just looking at you like
you bunch of hippies.
You bunch of hippies, right? And so pride's a danger, I think, in both directions, which is why food should never be the issue.
Well, you talk about food a lot in the book, and we talked about food a lot right there.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk about money for a minute. Basically, the premise of the book is that all of the things of earth, in some sense, are God speaking to us about himself, right? So when we come to the concept of wealth, we've heard Pastor John stand in this pulpit, for anybody who's been here long enough to have heard this guy, his name's John Piper, preach. He yells about money a lot, and there's yelling about money in the Bible if the 1 Timothy 6 could carry a tone. Yeah. So, and you have a lot to say about it. I have a supporter, or had a supporter on my campus outreach staff support team, who had a house on an island that you have to take a ferry to. It was a $2 million house. Bells and whistles across the board, projector screen that came down, deck over the house, whole deal. And I looked at that, and my thought was, there's got to be a line somewhere. Speaking of that for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one, and I've actually appreciated the way that John's attacked this, because what he's tended to do is he's tended to try to preach those texts, the 1 Timothy text or the Jesus sell it all and give to the poor kind of text, and then lodge the arrow, but not give the line that we all want. Right? What we want is give me the cutoff point, make me, what's the income level, what's the home price level that's the godly one, and I'll be right under that. Right? That's what most of us would do. Like figure out what the line was, and we'd just be right underneath it.
$2.99, $9.99.
Yeah, that's right. But there's not a line. I think the issue would be, to look into that kind of situation and go, you got a house like this. What's the house being used for? Is it mainly marked by accumulation of stuff at the expense of others, and it's just which will become manifest in a host of other ways, I think? Or is this a place where life and light, where people are welcomed, and not just people who are like us, but other people who aren't like us, right? That we're inviting others to our parties and things like that, and that there's a welcoming environment, that it's being used for a base of ministry, and then how much of whatever this costs, how much more is there that's being used in generosity and things like that. And so, and oftentimes we don't have access to that information, right? Like, so you're talking about a supporter, a guy who's funding your ministry on a college campus. And so at least at some level that there's some generosity happening here. And so I think we ought to be slow to judge here as well. It's not to say that you don't, so it would be, the issue would be something like, if you're in that context where there's wealthy people here at Bethlehem, very wealthy people, and if you're a pastor and you get to that passage in the Bible and you feel like, I'm not going to say that because I don't want to lose those wealthy, church members, that's a problem, right? You ought to lodge the arrow and say, this is what Jesus said money's for. But what's really interesting, this is something that came out when I was writing the book. I had never noticed this before. But one of the passages, that 1 Timothy 6 passage at the end, it's 1 Timothy 6:17. Pastor Jason preached on this, I think, last fall. And it says, as for the rich in this present age, teach them not to be haughty, nor to set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God. And you think, okay, good, that's the message the rich need. Don't be proud. Don't trust in the uncertainty of your riches, but trust in God. But then the very next thing he says is, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. And the thing that just landed on me was, Paul is talking to rich people and wants to make sure he reminds them that God gives stuff for their enjoyment. Like, that's crazy to me. Like, that's not, like, I'm not going into rich people's houses and going, hey, I just want everybody to know here, God gives you everything to enjoy it. Like, that's not my default. Like, I'm a wartime bent, and I'm like, I want to go in there and start turning tables over maybe, right? That's my natural inclination. He doesn't stop there. He goes on and he says, God richly provides us everything to enjoy. They should be generous, open-handed, willing to share, storing up, rich in good works, storing up for what is truly life. And so that's the verse. You got to finish the passage, but in the midst of that passage, Paul wants to say, you're rich, remember, God gives you everything for your enjoyment. He richly provides you with everything for enjoyment. So God is rich, he richly provides, you should enjoy it richly, and you should be rich in good works. Like, that's richness ought to abound in the Christian life.
Right.
And that would be more of the mark of even in a very wealthy context. And the challenge, like we've talked about, I think you and me were talking about before, but it's worth saying here, is you can't, as soon as you peg it to a number and say, it needs to be under this, there's always going to be the next guy who comes along and say, it's got to be under that.
Right.
And you're always going to be working down.
You're minimalizing the minimalist.
Yeah, minimalizing the minimalist, right? If the answer is how low can you go, somebody will always be able to go lower. And so, if you think about even just us being here in this room compared to other places in the world who don't have anything like this, you're just in a recipe for guilt. You're just going to create a false guilt that's actually going to kill generosity more than it's going to stoke it.
That's good. Yeah, in the book, I think one of the things you draw out that's really helpful is the idea that riches by themselves are not the issue. In fact, if we think of poverty as the aim, then what are we doing when we decide to go help an impoverished nation in Africa, right? Yeah. Anything that we give them is a move toward wealth, not away from wealth.
Right.
But in 1 Timothy 6, so it's clear, as for the rich in this present age, right?
Right.
That means they're rich people. And he didn't say, as for the rich in this present age, don't be rich.
Right.
He says, set your hope on God.
Be generous.
Be generous.
Right.
But it does say a few verses earlier, it says, by this desire.
Yeah.
many have,
Yep.
wandered away from the faith, pierced themselves with many pangs.
Yep.
So can we want to be rich?
Yeah, so it's dangerous, and part of it's actually something that recently, even with my kids have discovered quarters. Like they discovered that like quarters are things, and they get excited. They realize that quarters can like go in little machines, and little trinkets that cost probably a penny to make come out, and they just so very profitable machines, I think. And they discovered this, and one of the things that I noticed, and then when I saw it in my boys, I remembered it from being a kid, where there was this like element of, I got $5, and it wasn't like I had anything in particular that I wanted, but it was just like the $5 itself and all of the possibilities it represented. Like I could buy this, and I could buy that, and I could buy this, and I could buy that, and I kind of felt like because I had the $5, I kind of had all that stuff too. Mm-hmm. And just seeing it then, and then recalling it, I felt like that's a really dangerous impulse to have, to basically fixate on the bills, which is simply a representation, right? Like the real wealth is the stuff that money buys. Like wealth is what you can buy with money. Money is just a measurement of it. It tells you how much you have, but the dollars in your pocket are worthless if you're on a desert island, right? What you really want is the food it can buy, the house, the car, all of that, what it can purchase, that's wealth. And so when you fixate on, I desire riches because of all the possibilities, that's really dangerous. It could be really good though. It would be something like, what I really want is I see all kinds of ministries around me that need money, and I really wish I could be a channel for them. So I don't desire to be rich because of wanting to pad my, live high on the horse. High on the hog. That's what it is. High on the hog. High on the horse.
Get
is
off
different.
your high horse.
Get off your high horse. There's horses and hogs. Yeah. You should not ride them.
Good things of earth. Man.
Yes. So not because you should get high on the hog, but so if you're thinking, man, Lord, if you opened up and used me as a channel for generosity, I would welcome that. Mm-hmm. That's different than desiring to be rich. But I think that there's a similar, you can see how the good impulse, Lord, make me a channel, look at all the possibilities that I can see if I had more income, can easily get twisted into, and look at all the luxuries I could also have. Mm-hmm. And that becomes the focus, and I think that's what Paul's hitting, is saying that desire will take you straight to destruction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. A couple more questions, and then I'll walk through some of these. Pastor John has made a statement a number of times over that's been super helpful for the church. We're made from mountains, not from mirrors, right? Yeah. And in your book, you could say your book could be summed up as we're made for pumpkin crunch cake and not for mirrors. But
that's right.
I think beyond that, the idea of other people.
Uh-huh.
So I like to think of, we're really, when you think about how we focus in life and what Christ has called us to, we're made for other people, not for mirrors. Is kind of where our aim, pinnacle of creation, however you want to think about it. So, but a lot of times, I'm married and I have children, and some of my feelings toward my wife or toward my kids could get to a place where I go, I'm not sure. I'm fearing idolatry because I might love them too much today. Right?
Yeah.
So what do I do with too much?
So
I don't know that you addressed this very much at the beginning. I don't want to hear it.
I want to take it out of the too much. It's not a too much issue. It's an integrated issue. Mm-hmm. So the way I talk in the book is that there's two ways that you can relate God to his gifts. One's what you can call a comparative approach, where you take the gift, whatever. So we're talking about Lisa. Mm-hmm. So put her on one side and put God on the other. And if you weigh them, who's heavier in your heart? Who's valued more? What's more important? And idolatry comes when the answer is she is. Mm-hmm. She's more important than God. If given the choice between God and her, I choose her. So let's go back to the garden for a minute. That's what's happening, right? Adam goes, I'm listening to the voice of my wife. I want her more than I want obedience to God. That's straight up idolatry. Mm-hmm. But the idolatry is separation, which weighs more, and we say godliness would be God does. He's more valuable than anything and everything put together. And an idolatry would be whatever the created thing is, it's more valuable. Having done that, that's not the only way, and I think this is where the challenge comes for so many of us, is we want to try to live there. But the issue is that we know God's more valuable, but I love her, or I love them, or I love it, or I delight. So what do I do with that delight? Can that be too much? And the answer for me is to bring them back together. and not to view them as comparative, put one on one side and one on the other, but to view them as this is a means to that, and that is a further means of enjoying this, and that there's this onward and upward glorification that happens where the more I love my wife, the more in tune I am to the great mystery that Paul says marriage is. And the more that I'm in tune to the great mystery of marriage, the more that I love my wife. Which is why, so the title from the book, the things of earth grow strangely dim. Part of where the title hit me because I was like, that's not my experience. My experience is the things of earth, the hymn writer's talking about sinful stuff, I know that. But the things of earth grow strangely bright. Like, my kids are more delightful when they're seen in the light of Jesus' face. Like, Jesus' glory shining on my family makes it better. And they're more vivid, more real to me. I'm more alive to it. And I think that's the way God designed it. And so then if that's what you do, if you separate temporarily and say, which is more important? Whom have I in heaven but you? Right?
Right.
That kind of text.
Right.
And then you say, and because the answer is I've got nothing but God, now I get everything back, then the question of too much is the wrong question, because however much your joy in your family goes up, that's how much it's carrying your joy in God with it.
Right.
So I don't think too much. I think this playtime with my boys is awesome. Let it go through the roof. I'm taking the governor off. I'm letting it shoot to the sky, because when I come up for air in a bit, and when I reflect on that moment, I've got something to really thank God for. Mm-hmm. And now I understand more about what it means for a father to delight in his son. And I know what God feels towards me. And all of that's more richer and fuller because I didn't shrink back from the created joy.
Right. So, to put it in a really simplistic way, if you're on the scale,
Yep.
and for me, Lisa's outweighing God, instead of saying, well, let me lighten the load on my emotional attachment to Lisa so that she can creep up and go like this and really not even touch God at all. You run over, you continue to look at her, and as a means is too simple a word, you can either read the book, but as a way of understanding the glory of God, and as your gratitude and delight grows in her, in him, then this becomes... this goes like that.
Then God becomes more real, and she becomes put in her proper place, which is as a gift, not as a God. That's right. That's absolutely right.
Okay. One more question from me. One thing, 1 Corinthians 10:31 is a core verse of our church culture. Whatever you do, whether you eat or you drink, or whatever you do, do it all the glory of God. We've heard Pastor John talk about drinking orange juice or maybe brushing your teeth to the glory of God. It's a great verse.
Which I think involves like brushing your teeth with a book in front of you. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, you don't want to do them at the same time.
Brushing your teeth and orange. No, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah, but you actually talk about that in the book too. But First Corinthians,
I had a bad experience.
Yeah, I think we all have at some point. It's
isn't that the worst? Yeah. Like you brush your teeth and then you're walking out the door and you don't even think about it, and you grab the orange juice and then you go, and it's awful.
Yeah, mint orange juice.
Gross.
Or menthol. 1 Corinthians 10:31, super sweeping umbrella verse. We need it, whatever you do. But when we start talking about how you're conscious of the glory of God, this is where I'm always discussing this with different people. It's like, okay, so we're called to be conscious of the glory of God all the time, right? But I have to talk to people.
Yeah.
And I'm not that mentally powerful.
Right.
So what do I do?
Yeah. And I think this is, what you just articulated was one of the things that probably initially instigated thoughts in this, is I feel the exact same thing, which is, if I want to be Godward, how do I actually live? Because I found that every time I actually wanted to pay attention to anything else, I'd feel a little bit guilty. It'd just be lingering. It was never defined. It was never like, ooh, bad, because I knew that wasn't really realistic, but it just kind of was this little voice in the back of your head going, how would I do this if I was really doing it to the glory of God? Because whatever it is I am doing isn't that. And that's where kind of the recognition, I don't remember where it first happened, but that time and finitude were good things, that were God's idea, and he thought they were good ideas. That I really wanted to say, I want to own that, which means that like right now, we're talking about God, but I'm not talking to God, and my conscious focus isn't there.
Yeah.
Right.
Other than every
time sometimes you ask a question, I'm like, oh, God help me. But I'm talking to you. I'm thinking about you guys. I'm thinking about the question, and so I'm manward, very much so right now. Horizontal, looking at it, talking about you. And that's what I'm doing with my food, that's what I'm doing with my kids. We're manward, we're horizontal. And so how do we keep it Godward? Well, the term that I picked up from Doug Wilson, which I really liked, was anchor points, which is we're going to anchor ourselves in various ways to God through prayer. So that's scripture reading, so God speaking to us speaking to God, through corporate worship. There's all sorts of ways where we directly engage with God, and those anchor us. Those drive stakes into the ground of our lives, so that now when we then turn our attention, our focus away from God directly and to the world he made,
right,
we're alive to him in it, in ways that we wouldn't be if we didn't anchor ourselves. We'd just drift along and they would become idols.
Sure.
And so the anchor points idea, so that there's a rhythm to our lives, a rhythm of going directly to God and then coming back down to creation, and going directly to God and coming back down to creation. And that rhythm is God designed, God intended, it's good. The debate, just if you're curious, the kind of debate that I think I had one time with Pastor John was whether or not that would endure in heaven. Right? Like in heaven, will there still be that rhythm of Godward back down to the new heavens, new earth?
Same level of finitude.
Right, yeah, there's the same level of finitude. And I think where we both came, I think you probably still lean in different directions, which is why I think it's good that he pushes on me, and I hope it's good that I push on him a little bit here. So that there's going to be that line between Godward and manward in heaven will be very different than we experience it now. Eye is not seen, ear is not heard, nor is the mind of man conceived. We don't know what that'll be like. But I'm really drawn, there's a great little poem by Tolkien. And in the poem, he has this line that I really love. He says, in paradise, you're talking about heaven, perchance the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day, capital D. So in paradise, the eye may stray from gazing upon God. So in paradise, perchance the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day and see the day, lowercase d, illumined. So to look away from God and to see whatever God was shining on, see the day illumined and renew from mirrored truth the likeness of the true. In other words, like even in heaven, is it going to be the kind of situation where, yes, we're going to be enjoying God, beatific vision, God is everything, there's no sun, there's no moon, it's just Jesus. And yet there's this world, this new heavens, new earth, renewed creation, and our eyes are going to look away from Jesus in order that by seeing him reflected in all of these ways, in the saints, in the glories that we'll experience there, and to see him reflected in those things will actually increase our joy. And it'll renew our joy in God. And I think that that's probably true. And then I think that then filters back into the way I think we ought to operate now.
Well, I lied about being done with my questions.
Okay.
So I know that in me, when you say that, so you say, when we get to heaven, there's going to be the whole Tolkien poem, and there's a part of me, the new nature, that says, yeah, I want to rejoice in God all the way, and everything that can display his glory, I want to see more of, because that's going to illumine the everlasting day, capital D. There's another thing in me, I know it's there, that when I hear about the idea of not looking directly at God, but looking at something else, there's some sort of titillation in me that goes, rebellion in me that goes, ha ha ha, right. I don't have to look at God, I can look at something else. And whatever hostility in my heart toward God is there, that's where it would capitalize. So there's the idolatry piece. So
So that's the part of you that needs to die. Yeah. And I think, one of the things we talked about, we were just kind of prepping earlier, was about that Galatians text. 6:14, may it never be that I would boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus, by which the world was crucified to me and I to the world. And so how does that fit in? Well, the point is that as we are, by our old nature, by nature children of wrath, in our sin, we need to die. Like we need to get crucified to the world, because all we do is run out and make idols out of the world. Our hearts are desire factories, which then manufacture idols when sin's running the show. And so that part needs to die. But the important thing is that when that part dies, when the idol factory gets shut down, the desire factory does not get shut down. Amen. Right? It gets reoriented. And so now the desires, including the desires for the things of earth, is renewed in that first way you talked about, which is new nature. I want to enjoy God reflected in all the ways that he can be reflected. And so the issue would be, have you actually died? Right? Like, have you died to the world? Have you been crucified to the world? Or have you only like been paper cut with the world, and called it death? I'm sort of dead to the world, but oh boy, I really want to fixate here. I want to so the Bible does talk this way. Like Paul says, don't set your mind on the things of earth. Don't set your mind on, meaning don't orient your life around them. Don't orient your affections around them. Don't put them at the center. Put God at the center and then go nuts.
Right.
Put God at the center and then absolutely go crazy with the world that he's made. That's what he made it for. It's going to reveal him.
It's really good. It feels dangerous.
It does. Yeah. And what's funny is it feels dangerous, and what often doesn't feel dangerous is the hot potato, the stiff arm, because that feels like, oh, that must be godly.
Yeah.
Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. That must be godly. And Paul says, yeah, that's borderline demonic. That has no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh.
Not even borderline.
Yeah.
According to 1 Timothy 4.
Yeah, according to 1 Timothy 4. You really do that hard,
Yeah.
and Paul says you're succumbing to the teaching of demons.
That's good. So danger on both sides.
Yeah, danger on both sides.
You need to beware, but danger on both sides. Good. Okay, this is just a curiosity. So tomorrow morning, I wake up, you wake up, hopefully, Lord willing, and we're laying in bed. I have all sorts of options of what I could do. There are good things that I could do at that moment. In my house, I'm laying in a bed on a pillow that feels nice. It's a thing of earth, feels nice. That's good. Reveals the glory of God in some sense.
Yep.
There's a Bible waiting for me. We have a little gas burning stove in our house. So it's more in light of the anchor points. I just want to hear how you think about this. What do I do when I wake up?
Yeah. I'm real reluctant to prescribe, partly because I've experienced enough seasonal variations in my own life about what that looks like. So the knee-jerk reaction is to say something like Bible before breakfast, which I think is in general, a good principle. But we talk that way around here, Bible before breakfast. And so you want to feed the soul before you feed the body, and that you'll enjoy the food better if you do that. And before you read the newspaper, and this is a real temptation, right? So now the temptation is really bad because right next to your bed you've got one of these things sitting there waiting for you, right? Yeah. And so there's things that you can check on.
Words of friends.
Yeah, there's Facebook and there's Twitter and there's all that kind of stuff, and it's right there, right at hand. And so because of that, I think that to say Bible before breakfast and Bible before this is the best answer. Having said that, though, I'm real reluctant to prescribe that it's got to look like this. Instead, what I would say is I evaluate myself anyway based on the fruit in my life. In other words, how do I know if my rhythms of Godwardness and then into the world, if my rhythms of meditation and the scriptures, rhythms of prayer, how do I know if those are operating well? I look at their fruit in my life. Am I becoming a more godly person? Am I being patient with my kids? Am I loving my wife? Am I being filled with joy? Do I find worship enriching and enlivening, or do I find it dull and dead? And if the answer to those questions is all good, then whatever I'm doing, I feel okay about, even if I'm missing a day of, I miss a fighter verse, or if I miss a chapter of the Bible, or if I miss a long stretch of them. I'm not worried mainly about that. I'm worried about the fruit. What I want to be attuned to is, if I get dull, if I get impatient, if I'm getting angry, if I'm getting frustrated, if I'm getting anxious, that's telling me something. It's telling me I'm not anchored. Go get anchored. Be anchored every day. Get back into the Bible.
Right.
Go for help, because you're drowning. You're starting to drown, or to use the Hebrews language, you're drifting. You're drifting away from the truth. And so that's how, when I think about getting up in the morning, it's whatever it is that's going to make me produce the fruit, abide in God so I can produce the fruit. And that might mean immediate scriptures. It might mean something else, different seasons.
That's good.
All right.
Okay. All right. We're going to get to some questions from some of you guys.
Okay, good.
Let's do this. Will you define the sin of gluttony and address it as your book might interact with it?
Yeah. Defining the sin of gluttony. So gluttony would be an inordinate fixation on food. I think that's how I define it. I'm a little hesitant to, partly because in a couple weeks, a number of us, so the Desiring God conference here in a couple weeks is on sin, And as a part of that, a number of us got together and wrote a little book on the 7 deadly sins. I had the chapter on envy, so gluttony's not my department. But I think Jonathan Bowers had the chapter on gluttony, and so he would know much better. So for one thing, if you're curious about that, I'm just going to say, go read Bowers, and if he disagrees with me, he's probably right. He's thought about it more. But for my own sake, I'd say an inordinate fixation on food, which means it can take the form of what we most commonly think of as gluttony, as in, gorging oneself and growing obese and all that kind of stuff because you're just constantly eating or something like that. Or, this is interesting, and Lewis in Screwtape Letters pokes at this, the person who's very particular about food, even if it's very small amounts of food, is in the grip of gluttony because they're inordinately fixated on it. Oh, I don't want that much. Oh, that's too much. Or I need it to be prepared quite this way. Or, so some of the food fussing stuff actually is related, I think, very closely to the sin of gluttony because it's taking food which is this natural, everybody needs it, we must have it, it's a built-in thing that God thinks is good, and it's elevating it to a place it ought not be in our lives, whether we're indulging that or whether we're so fixated on it that we're particular.
Sure. So I like a restaurant called Miyabi. All right, it's a Japanese steakhouse. It's in the South. It's better than all the ones up here. And they give substantial portions of food.
Yes.
And I like to pound that food. And I'm full. Sometimes really full. So it's a feast of sorts. But I think in that moment, my fear is if I eat a ton of this food, I'm a glutton. And so people are saying, if I eat one more bite, I'm going to be a glutton. So how do you treat maybe episodic eating like that?
Well, I think one thing that the Bible does commend to us is feasting. So, right, Israel's entire calendar was built on feasting, right? So there's these 7-day parties. So none of us, I don't think, at this point are approaching that level of feasting. Where it's like we're all going to take off work for about 2 weeks. And all we're going to do is eat and drink and be merry. And so maybe we should bring that back. I saw somebody this last Christmas talking about bringing back the 12. There's some traditions that have the 12 days of Christmas, and as they described it, I thought that wouldn't be all bad. And so on the one hand, I want to say I wouldn't pinpoint that as a gluttony issue. So in other words, eating till you're full. There's biblical imagery that wants to connect the feeling of fullness and fatness, even eating of the fatness of his house, the rich foods, to kind of this is a picture of heaven. This is a picture of the fullness of God. You won't know until you've had a really good meal, in some ways, like your capacity to understand the fullness of God is impoverished. And that's dangerous. I can feel, even as those words came out of my mouth, how dangerous it is to say the best way to increase your ability to enjoy God is to enjoy really good food all the time.
Because who doesn't do that?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, because
billions of people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't want to suggest that at all because there's ways that fasting also increases our. So there's these rhythms of feasting and fasting that I think ought to be. This is again that's that rhythm question. There's times where we fast from food in order to say God's better. We want Him, and then we feast. We have Sabbath meals. We have large gatherings of celebration where we enjoy as a foretaste of this is what God is preparing for us.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's where I'd go.
So I heard a missionary. This is connected not as much to food, but I heard a missionary one time. He's working with an impoverished group in Africa and doing some water mission stuff and things. And basically, they don't have clean water, running water a lot of time. And he encouraged us to take quick, 45-second showers.
Right.
Because of the wasting of water. How would you respond to that? Like, is there a sense of guilt that we should feel as Americans?
So taking a 45-second shower here in America,
or eating at Miyabi.
Okay, yeah. So I'd say
here in America.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in other words, you're not like robbing a small village of its water supply by living it up in the luxuriant showers, in the bush. Okay. That's right. Okay. So here, I don't think the simple fact of going without. The problem in the world, I don't think, is that because I ate something, somebody else didn't get to eat something. Like it's not a zero-sum game. Like the more I eat, the less they have.
Right.
Okay. So you get. I don't think. I actually never met anybody who's done this to their kids. At least I don't remember my parents doing it. But we always joke about like when your kids don't want to eat the food. There's people in China who are starving, and so eat it, or we're gonna and the kids like send it to them. So that's not how it works. That's not biblical. That's not wise economics. That's not the way the Bible commends itself to us in terms of how blessing happens other places. The simple fact of going without is 99% of the time not the reason why it would get there.
Right.
So there's no virtue in simply going without. Now, there might be virtue in going without in order to actively meet the need. In other words, so like this is sell your possessions and give to the poor. Instead of devoting money this direction, I'm going to devote it that direction in order to meet needs. That's valuable. What's not valuable is simply saying, I'm not going to, so I would say taking a 45-second shower is a kind of way, it's like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch.
Right.
It has the appearance of godliness and the severity of the body, but it's of no value in stopping indulgence of the flesh.
That's great. Couple here. One, I noticed there are no cats on the cover of Things of Earth. Intentional?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, okay. And it's not because they're not images of divine things. They're just images of the devil. I mean, like vultures. Vultures are images of, demon. Like Edwards has this great stuff. You go read Edwards' little notebooks on typology where he's like identifying images of divine things. He's like, vultures are images of the devil. They prey on carcasses and they devour. Lions can be images both of good things,
right.
like, Lion of tribe of Judah, or bad things like the devil is a roaring lion seeking to devour. Notice he's a cat.
Right.
So, and so Jesus can be a lion because lions are not only cats, but awesome, whereas normal cats are just cats.
My cat, Prickle, was a great cat, Joe. Uh-huh. And if this is my cover, I'd have Prickle right on the middle.
Okay, so there's another book, Dog Theology, Cat Theology. Maybe you guys have heard of this. You guys heard this. So the dog thinks, here's this person who provides for me, loves me, does everything for me. They must be God. And the cat thinks, here's this person who provides for me, does everything for me. I must be God. So cats is a picture of that. That's right. Cat says, you provide, do everything for me. I must be God. And I think, yeah, that's like sinful human beings. That's the devil.
Sure. Okay. A couple of good ones here. How do you navigate enjoying books and movies that are a delight to you, but have offensive content? Hashtag Things of Earth.
Hashtag Things of Earth. Okay. So I think what we're talking about in enjoying creation applies straight across to culture. It gets a little bit trickier because of that kind of question. It would depend on the offensive content. So there's ways of portraying violence in a movie that aren't sinful. Okay, so real violence, murders and genocides and things like that are evil. But there are but you can act out that evil without yourself committing evil. Does that make sense? So you can, in other words, if we were up on stage and we were acting and I shot you with the blank gun and you fell over
right.
and I murdered you,
right.
No, you didn't actually die and I didn't actually shoot you and nobody actually sinned.
Right. Unless they liked it.
Unless they liked the murdering aspect of it. Right. But if the whole point was to show how I got it in the end,
right.
and so there's justice in the world.
Yeah, that's it.
Or a good example would be a movie like Hotel Rwanda, right, which depicts the Rwandan genocide. And there's some horrific scenes in that movie. But the whole point of depicting the horrific scene is so that your heart recoils at the evil and cries out for justice, right? It's like parts of the Bible that describe horrors, and that you're meant to come out of your chair a little bit. So if it's that kind of offensive content, I think there's ways to enjoy the overall picture, provided you're fixating on the evil part and delighting in, I love it when the bad guy wins or something like that. That's dangerous. Delighting in evil, calling evil good, that's dangerous. But if it's a part of the story in which the bad guy gets thrown into prison or gets, the
White Witch dies.
The White Witch dies, then to have a White Witch isn't a problem. Probably what the question's asking a little bit is about sexual content. And this is trickier because there isn't a way to portray sexual immorality or even sexual virtue, like if it was a married couple on a screen, without committing some kind of sin. In other words, I can pretend to shoot him, but if they're making out and, if it's a sexually immoral scene, they're not pretending.
Right.
Right? They're actually doing something that's sinful. They're engaged in the act itself. And therefore it's a much harder situation. In my case, so there's movies that, this is what Hollywood does. They put that one scene in there just because they feel like they have to. Titillation. And I think there's virtue in saying, we're going to fast forward through that scene.
Right.
Or, there's plenty of movies that I've gone to not knowing that was going to happen. And it's, all right, I'm going to look at the floor for however long I have to look at the floor.
What time is it for the next minute?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and that's virtuous, I think, to avoid it. And then there's degrees, and it's a wisdom call. You should not delay, here's the kind of principle. If you wouldn't watch your neighbor doing it, like, in other words, like, just pretend that the screen is actually a window into your neighbor's house. Would you feel okay about that? And if you wouldn't, then I'd say you shouldn't be looking at it on the screen. Right? I wouldn't mind watching my neighbor pretend to kill someone if it was a part of a play. Like that, if in other words, that's just part of, that's legitimate. But I would very much think it's offensive to, and wicked to be a voyeur and to engage and watch somebody else.
So your answer is really from the perspective of voyeurism, as opposed to, like, I think some might say, let's say, for example, on the screen, there was a demonstration of proper marital sexuality.
Yep.
To delight in proper marital sexuality is a yay.
Yeah.
But to be a voyeur is a nay.
Right.
So, of course.
So it would be, there's, I saw a movie recently where the actors in the movie were actually married to each other in real life. And so to see them, the same kinds of displays of marital intimacy that would be appropriate if we were friends would be appropriate on a screen. The same kinds of marital intimacy that would be inappropriate for me to watch, but which I'm happy are happening, right? Like, in other words, it's good that there's marital intimacy happening. I shouldn't be anywhere near it. It's none of my business. And so that's the kind of dynamic that so it is the voyeur thing is, I think, a big part of it.
This one actually is a little bit of a double click on culture. Can I tell my parents to stop speaking in terms of too much about Halo?
No, because I know who's asking that question,
Yep.
and the answer is no. Your parents are right.
But for real, how does Things of Earth apply to entertainment media? And I think especially, I work with college students.
Right.
Video game culture
Yep.
runs rampant.
Yep.
So how do you address that in terms of, playing the video game, there's some entertainment value there, Thing of Earth.
Yeah, so there's a period in college where I played lots of video games.
Which ones?
It was Halo.
Halo, okay. The irony.
The irony. It's from personal experience,
Okay,
right?
okay.
And I can say, yes, the answer is you play it too much. Any counsel would not be a no. It's always sinful to play video games. That's not true, any more than it's always sinful to read a book or always sinful to watch a movie. I think that there's particular dangers with video games because of the way that they occupy an inordinate amount of so many young men's lives. It's mainly young men. So a good book is like not like this nonfiction. I'm thinking
Might as well say this one.
So a good book. I don't know if you found a good book anywhere.
Whatever.
Narnia, Lord of the Rings, whatever. A good book ought to ennoble the soul and make you want to live your life better. You ought to be more. That's what a good book should do. Insofar as video games do something similar, then I think that they're performing a perfectly valid recreational entertainment kind of function. The danger, I think, is that they're actually performing, for many guys, a different function, which is an alternative to living in the real world, right? So I don't actually want to engage with normal people, real people, because that's hard. What's easy is beating this level,
right?
Or getting lost in this, so
killing the dragon and getting the girl on the screen.
So killing the dragon and getting the girl in a story is meant to make me want to go be a better husband and a father. Right. Killing a dragon and getting the girl over and over and over again in the basement in the dark for like Cheetos. Hours on end with Cheetos, something's gone amiss. The desire. Russ Moore had a great article on this a number of years ago at Desiring God, where he talked about fake love, fake war, and talked about pornography and video games as these addictive things that are basically gross parodies, ugly parodies of sexual pornography is a gross parody of genuine, authentic, God-given sexuality, and video games, when they're conducted in that kind of obsessive capacity, are fake war. It's men were made to fight stuff,
right. And
this is a way of pretending to. And if the pretending to actually led you to be a better husband, a better father, to be a better friend, and college students,
practice.
If it actually showed up in the real world, then I'd say you're great. That's fine. I'd be willing to bet that 9 times out of 10, a guy who's asking that question, it's not the case for him. And so, just to be clear, like there's one time a year, usually it's about one time a year, when I'm at home for Christmas with my brothers, we have like a kind of a video game night. right? So we play Halo for about 3 or 4 hours, and that's our fix for the year. It's my fix for the year. I think he probably plays more. But we have this night, and it's fun. It's enjoyable. It's time of fellowship. I get that there's camaraderie. That's real. It's not. That's a legitimate thing, just like playing board games or just like playing any other kind of recreational
medium
activity.
for relationship.
Exactly. But when it becomes isolating, when it becomes, and there's scary stuff when you start to hear about kind of stuff that goes on in Japan and other places where it's just it's a replacement for real life.
People waste away. Okay. Here's a good question. How can preferences show a lack of delight in food, music, etc.?
Yeah, this is a good question. I had this one come up. I don't think I actually addressed it in the book directly, so this is good. So this should be something like this. So I used myself earlier. I said I don't like coffee. In fact,
or cats.
Or cats. Although there's a difference between them because one of those is godly and okay. But so I've never had a cup of coffee, and I have no desire to. And I don't like raw onions. When I was younger, I would tell people that I was allergic to bubble gum because I didn't like it, and I didn't want them to offer it, and I didn't want to tell them that I didn't like it because I was a coward.
Can we just say that there's a difference between coffee and raw onions? I don't know that there are a lot of people out there that are like, I got to get my raw onions in the morning.
Yeah, right.
There are a lot of people who want the coffee.
So, but it's a preference
It tastes
thing.
like bitterness in my mouth.
Yeah.
I don't like
coffee. Just give me a Dr. Pepper and we're good.
Sure.
But it's a preference thing. So the question I have to ask myself is, God's communicating some part of his glory through those raw onions and through that coffee. Am I robbing myself of some measure of that fullness by having a preference, by saying I'm abstaining because out of a preference? And I think the answer may be yes. Like in heaven, maybe I'll like coffee. But I think it'll be because my tongue's transformed. Not that, then maybe coffee will be better. But this is also an element of some people like football, and some people like baseball, and some people like the symphony. And the fact that some people don't like that I'm not going to go watch a symphony, or I'm not going to listen to a symphony, or I'm not going to watch a baseball game, isn't necessarily a defect on their part, because Christ plays in 10,000 places, and you'll have eternity to find other ways. Right. So there's aspects of God that can be communicated in the same thing being communicated in multiple ways, and so I can get. I know what bitter is, and I don't need coffee to remind me every day.
Right. The gall and the bitterness.
The gall and the bitterness.
Wormwood,
I just have my, brush my teeth, have my orange juice, and I remember, and I don't need coffee.
And unless it has 6 sugars.
So the point is, the simple answer. So I wouldn't say to someone, the fact that you have preferences means you're robbing yourself. Okay, that's not how I think. Although now I'm thinking about like my son, who sometimes doesn't like to eat. He has a very narrow palate, and I'm thinking, at some level, maybe it does. So that's a good question. Maybe I need to think more about it.
Sure. Here we go. Some people fast. You address fasting just briefly. Some people fast from things of earth. From hashtag things of earth. That was clever. Besides just food, especially during Lent. Maybe you can address Lent a little bit here, but is this a good idea or warranted?
Yeah. So fasting from entertainment or something like that. I don't think it's
meat.
Yeah. Well, or a particular food, not a fasting from all food. You mean?
Yeah. Or there are a whole bunch of different things you can do for 40 days.
So I'd say fasting from when the Bible talks about fasting, it's talking about fasting from food. I don't think it's talking about fasting from entertainment, and it's certainly not. This is one place that people kind of get tripped up. It's not fasting from sinful things. That's just called sanctification. Like there's
you don't fast from pornography.
You don't fast from pornography.
That's right.
That's not how that operates. But like I'm taking a fast from my iPhone, or I'm taking a fast from Facebook. I think that there's an analogy there between what fasting is, but I would be reluctant to call that fasting, because I think in the Bible the connection with food, which is a necessity of life, right, which Facebook isn't, and entertainment's not, and whatever.
What about sex? It does say 1 Corinthians 7, fasting from sex for a little while.
I don't know if it calls it fasting.
Or I say abstinence.
Yeah, so it's abstinence, and that's what I'm wondering is if fasting in the Bible is meant to say, here's something that's essential to your life, and I want you to give it up for a temporary amount of time in order to remind yourself that your love is better than life, right? That kind of thing. God is better, and that there's a difference even with sex. In a marriage where a husband and wife abstain for a time to devote themselves to prayer, I'd say there's at least an analogy there, but I'm reluctant to call it that. And I think that it's a wise practice. I think for somebody who goes, I think I may be spending too much time on Facebook, to say I'm going to take a break from Facebook. Whether I would talk about that as a fast is where it's a language thing more than a substance thing probably.
Sure. Okay. Let's see if we got, are there gifts that we ought not try to enjoy on the Sabbath, like a Green Bay loss? That's what it says here, as a gift. And based on what principle? So things of earth on the Sabbath. This is a big time biblical controversy.
It's funny, there's in one of Jonathan Edwards' resolutions, he has one that resolved never to laugh or make mirth. I think it's never to make mirth on the Sabbath. And it's one of the few places probably where I think Edwards is just out to lunch. I think the Sabbath was made for laughing. And so I'd say the main goal of us, so if we're talking Sabbath is in Sunday, and we're New Covenant Christians in which the Sabbath restrictions aren't applied straight across or anything like that, but where we set aside a day to worship God and celebrate Him, insofar as watching a Green Bay loss or other kinds of activities is competing with an orientation on God directly, then I'd say it's a problem. But if there's a real, robust engagement with God directly in corporate worship, in other words, I think it's a big problem when parents, take their kids, when they skip church because they got a tournament, right? That's communicating something very deadly, I think, to kids, that church, God comes second to baseball. But if robust worship's happening, then I think whatever forms of fellowship, whether it's watching a football game together, whether it's playing football together, whether it's playing some board games, whether it's taking a nap, like all the form, like recreation, Sabbath, rest, celebration are legitimate, and that's what the Sabbath is for. It's meant to be a delight. It's meant to be the time of the week when you should not feel those pressures of, I got to get this done for the office, or I got to get my homework done, or I got to get this. That's the one day where the one thing you should not do is whatever it is you do the rest of the week. And on this day, you ought to do things that enrich your soul, build relationships with people, refresh yourself, because you get to rest, because tomorrow there's work to be done.
Okay. Okay, I have a question for you from my own thing, my own question from the book, and you can address this. In one chapter in the book, maybe it's when you're talking about created to be a creature. Where do we move from that? When are you talking about mission? Which chapter is that?
Oh, yeah, that's it.
That's it. And the idea of there's kind of a spectrum where, on the one hand, God gives us gifts like food and things to be enjoyed, but they're also fuel for our mission, to bear God's image, to enjoy His glory, or to at least bear His image through mission. He gives us fuel for mission. And you think about food, it's pretty simple. You can, whatever you do, whether you eat or you drink, whatever you do to all the glory of God, there's a way to eat or drink to the glory of God when you say, this water is refreshing. There's a coolness to it, or a, however you want to think about it, the refreshment that reminds me of the refreshing that comes from the Spirit of the Lord. And then on this side, you have the idea that this water hydrates me for the task at hand. Yep. And we were talking about this earlier. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's the part where the magician, who's kind of the god figure of this island of the Duffel-Puds, for those of you who are familiar, is talking about the garden that he gave them to cultivate. And he says, when I gave them the garden, it wasn't for me, it was for them, for their enjoyment, basically. He said they insisted on trudging up to the top of the mountain to get water when there was a stream that ran right next to the garden. They insisted on doing this, but it was actually for them. And I just want you to formulate for me how we think about our mission. It's easy to see how food tasting good is for us, but our mission is that for us in some sense as well, as good Christian hedonists. Yeah, so in the book, I do say gifts are given for our enjoyment, gifts are given for mission. They're both. But there's also a sense in which mission is given for our enjoyment. Like that's one of the needs, I think needs is probably not too strong a word, that we have as human beings, is to accomplish something. God built us to build, to make, to create, to do. That to have tasks and to complete tasks is part of what it means to be made in His image, because that's what He's like. He does stuff. He's the God who works wonders, and therefore as image bearers, we want to also work wonders on a lesser sub-creative scale, and that's true of whatever vocation we're talking about. Whether it's you're getting paid for it, or whether it's a hobby, whether it's homemaking, whatever it is, we're built to do stuff. And that there's that itself is a gift, that labor is a gift, that work is a gift. So when God put Adam in the garden and says, work it and keep it, He's giving him something.
He's not taking from him, saying, it's not like, I could have made you just to sit around all day, but instead I'm going to, and that's what you're really for, is to sit around all day, but I'm going to take your time and make you work. No, I'm giving you a job because that's what you're built to do. Right. And so that the mission is, so that there's ought to be this kind of onward and upward kind of movement to it, where we worship God directly, and then we're off into mission in order to enlarge ourselves and bring others in so that we can worship God more and then be sent out more, and that it's onward and upward until Jesus comes back. And then after that, it'll be even cooler.
Yeah.
In other words, the tasks of heaven, like heaven's Sabbath rest, but that's not inactivity. That's not sitting around. That's not one endless nap, although maybe there'll be naps in heaven.
I gotta hope so.
But there will be things to be done. And what that'll look like, eyes not seen, ears not heard. But we ought to anticipate that there will be a world to explore. Like God's creation, we're not going to get to heaven and have our minds just, we know everything. No, it's like now we're going to actually know what our minds are for. Now, they're going to kick it into high gear, and they're going to be free from sin, and it's now go find me everywhere. I've hidden myself all throughout creation. Go look. And that's when it really gets going. And so we should think in heaven there's going to be tasks, jobs. We're going to really get to know the elements of the universe in ways that we can't even fathom now.
Yeah. I'm going to double click on that for a second, and you can tell me, you can table this if you want to. So we're made for accomplishment.
Yeah.
So we're made to enjoy the glory of God in our accomplishment. It's like, sometimes I'll talk to our students about the idea that we could have just been made as a pair of eyes, and all we do is just look, right? And even then you get into all sorts of image bearing, seeing or whatever, but instead we were given a body and minds that function, and then the vocation of moving forward. Now, I lay on my bed at the end of the day. Do I say, I did a great job? Is that what I say at the end of the day? How does this correlate with, so now I am a creator, accomplisher of sorts.
Yeah.
I lay in my bed. What's my mindset at that point?
Yeah, good. It's 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And that grace did not prove fruitless, but I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, it was the grace of God that was with me. And so you can, at the end of the day, say, I worked hard. Whether you have to include the comparative or not, I don't.
Right.
But I worked hard, and this is, and so I worked hard, but it wasn't me. It was the grace of God that was with me. So that there's a real sense of I was in it, I was involved in it, I was engaged in it. It was me, and yet it wasn't me. It was God working in and through me. And this really does get back to that where we started at the beginning with that Trinitarian piece. Like this is the participation, right? You're in the game. And this is what life's about, is being drawn in, not just to come into the fellowship of the Trinity like a bump on a log and stand there in the corner and go, wow.
Yeah.
But to actually join the dance.
Right.
Like they're dancing. You join the dance, get in, and that looks like, and so it's really you. And so it's really
and you're good at it.
Yeah, when you begin to think that way, it's an incredibly liberating thing. So there's times when I've been getting ready to preach or teach or something like that, where I felt this acutely in a really, it's a peculiar feeling to me because it doesn't happen all the time. But it's a sense of I'm about to do what I think God has built me to do. I'm the axe who's about to hit the tree. And everybody has something like that, right? Like there's some aspect, whether it's your job, whether it's your kids, whether it's you're like, I'm about to do what I was built to do. And there's an anticipation and an eagerness for it that's not everybody look at me.
Right.
But it's I'm really glad it's me because this is what I was made to do. And Lewis has this great image where he said, I think it's from Screwtape as well, where he says something like, God's end in the end is to make it so that a man could build the best cathedral, know it was the best cathedral in the world, and be neither more nor less glad that he built it, but just to be glad that it is. And that's a great quote because it's meant to say it's about the work itself, but there's also an element of, there's an added joy of, but I was the tool. There's a personal participation. I'm not just an observer, a spectator. I'm not on the outside looking in. I'm in the game, and I just want to be in the game. And I think when that becomes your mindset of, I want to be in the game, yet not I, it was the grace of God that was with me, it's incredibly freeing. Because there isn't any room for pride at that point, because the relationship between God's working through you and your efforts is so tight that there's no little pats on the back because you did something.
Right. Your credit is non-existent.
Yeah.
but the participation, that's joy. That's like double joy.
Yeah.
Do you think in First Thessalonians 2, when Paul says, what is our boasting, our crown of exaltation is coming, is not even you, that there's a personal participation element to that?
Yeah, because he just said that, or maybe after, we'd shared with you not only the gospel, but our very lives.
Right.
And so you're, like, I'm so engaged, like, we're so intertwined at this point that when we get to heaven and stand before Jesus and he says, what's your glory? I'm going to hold you up.
That's right.
And say, look what I did. And Jesus is going to say, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master.
Right.
And there's not going to be any room for pride there.
Right. The credit would all be Jesus's for all the causing of all the growth, but your personal participation is so tied in that you say, you guys, you're here with me and I was part of it. Okay.
Yep. Another instance of this would be in marriage. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, man is the image and glory of God, woman is the glory of man. I think it's a similar idea. The whole point of godly masculinity exists so that godly femininity can flourish. Right? She's the glory, right? So it's like in dancing, the men's supposed to lead, but everybody's supposed to have their eyes on her. Right? He's leading, right? He's the one who's steering the ship, but the whole point of him steering the ship is so that she can shine. And if you think in those ways, you can come into a church context. This is a little bit off topic, but you can come into a church context and where they're really about masculinity, and you can find out whether, like, godly masculinity, and you can find out whether it's true by whether or not the women are flourishing. Because if the women aren't flourishing, if they feel crushed, hindered, hampered, beat down, then you can go, whatever's happening here, the glory looks like it's being trampled in the dust, right? On the other hand, if you come into a context where women are thriving and flourishing, then what you probably have there is a lot of godly men who are sacrificing in order to make, in order that can happen. But it's a similar kind of. Yeah. I don't know how we got into that, but it's fun. All right.
Okay. We're getting toward the end here. How does this all affect decision making? How do we choose between competing things of earth, i.e. a new pair of jeans or a good book? So we're talking about value, good, things of earth. How do we start making decisions?
Yeah, I think it's a
broad question.
Yeah, it's a broad question, and it really is a personal judgment call. In other words, some of that's personal preference. So, like, new pair of jeans. Well, how's your old pair of jeans doing? Mine has a big hole in it. Then that's going to trump the good book. Most other times, if the jeans are okay, it's a book every time for me. But it really is a question of how has God built you? Where are your desires? Where are your delights? Where are your joys? Where do you find him? When Christ plays in 10,000 places, he's playing everywhere. Where do you hear him best? And I think you want to cultivate those places. So I found actually that there are a number of places that are hugely helpful to me in deepening gospel roots in my life for when hard times come. And that I intentionally drill those wells deep so that when hard times come, I can go back to them and I can find help. So, like, when I hit depression, I go to Narnia. Amen. Probably as much as I go to the Bible. Now, it's dangerous to say that. Because what Narnia does is it awakens something in me that then, because the Bible feels like it's just heavy, it's not there, it's just words on a page, it's not doing anything. Narnia does something, and it's just personal. I mean, obviously other people have it, but it may be music, it may be nature, it may be something, whatever it is for you, like to be able to go to those things and to maximize those things so that then all of a sudden the heart awakening and enlargement that happens through Narnia, through the sunset, through the rainstorm, through the music, whatever it is, your heart opens up a little bit, and all of a sudden when you turn back to the Bible feels different, right? And I think that's a way that our indirect Godwardness, our engagement horizontally with the things of earth, serves and enhances our direct Godwardness, right? That helped open me up to things that I would not have been if I could have sat there and I could have sat there and I could have sat there, but listening to that song did something to my heart. It softened it, and now all of a sudden the soil was ready. When the word hit it, it blew.
Tore the veil right off.
Right.
Yeah. Let's narrow that question a little bit. Let's talk about the distinction between people and stuff, because the book has a good bit on both. So now we're talking about value judgments in two different entities. Yeah.
Yeah. In general, so I talk about there's a scale of values that there is a biblical one. Like God's more important than everything else. People are more important than things. and that's pretty basic. So things and that they exist, the things at the bottom exist to serve the things at the top. So stuff exists for people. Money exists for people. Wealth exists for people. Stuff exists for people. And so what that means, like in a wartime context, is you ought to think, when you think, what does strategic mean? Well, is it serving the good of people? Their physical good, material good, their spiritual good, their emotional good. Are the things of earth, the stuff, is it serving that? If it's not, then it's probably doing it wrong.
Right.
But but you've just widened it pretty broad, so that making a good meal is serving people really, really in a concrete way, so that your delight in making the food is really a delight not just in making the food, but in the reaction that it produces in the people, and that you're thinking of it in those terms, which is all done so that God's glorified in this fellowship, this little mini dance that's happening in your dining room on Sunday night.
So Trinitarian fullness is
Spilling
always
over.
reflected everywhere.
Yeah. Right.
Because all this stuff is relational on some level.
Yeah, the universe is relational, stuff exists for people, and therefore it can't help but be relational. That's right.
Yeah.
In fact, stuff isn't stuff. Trees aren't trees until people see them and know what they're for. Like a tree hasn't really become a full tree. A dog isn't really a dog until he's man's best friend. Right? It's channeling Lewis there. Dogs don't become really doggy, he says, until they become man's best friend, until they engage with man. There's something about that combination. And so trees, are there, but they're built to be seen and known as images of divine things by God's image bearers. Until that happens, until that gets actualized, the tree hasn't really come into its own.
Yeah.
If it was, which is kind of cool when you think about the universe for a minute, just how big it is, and you kind of think about what eternity is going to be like. It's like, I'm going, hey, space travel, baby. Let's do this. Because it's like, why is it so big? So that God, you have something to do for forever.
Ever. Yeah. Ever expanding universe.
Yeah, ever expanding. Yeah, right.
So, okay, this is maybe the last question.
Okay, that's good.
Heavenly rewards. Sometimes we can consider ourselves mercenary, I think, for saying, I'm going to go love Joe so I can get another wing on my heavenly mansion.
Yep.
But if the things of earth are so good, so my wife and I were looking at houses on MLS online the other day, and the houses within the city in the area we're going to potentially move, not super nice, but we like to play a little bit, and so we look at, I looked at this cabin in Ely that was unbelievable, right? It had a hot tub, and then, it overlooks the lake and the whole thing. And I started thinking about this, wings on your mansion, because I thought, houses are amazing. You go drive around Lake Harriet, those houses are amazing. So my question is, ought we to desire another wing on our mansion in heaven? And maybe how does that connect to how we think about heavenly rewards? The second one is a little longer than the first one, probably.
I think it depends on how you're desiring the extra wing in relation to other things you'd be desiring about heaven. So as one of the many things that you could have, sure. But if that trumps, not even, I want the wing more than I want to see Jesus. No one's going to say that. But that would be bad. But even like being reunited with family members, the saints, and a whole host of other delights, I think that those ought to proportionally be more delightful than the prospect of having just simply a larger mansion. And I know that the heavenly mansion thing is this. I'm curious about how it actually got all fleshed out, because it seems to be some combination of Jesus saying, I'm going to prepare rooms for you, and I have a house with many rooms, I'm going to prepare one, and then something about, I'm going to put you over 10 cities, and then it's just all that kind of got mishmashed together, and so we talked about heavenly mansions and heavenly shacks and stuff like that, and I just think it's weird. And I think instead we ought to think more in terms of what are the actual, get concrete with the things you love now, and really believe that nothing good will ever finally be lost.
Right.
Like every joy that you can point to, every legitimate joy you can point to on earth will be there but glorified. And if it's not there as itself, it will be present in some other joy which you don't have an imagination built for yet. And I think to think so about heavenly rewards, to think of heavenly rewards as enlarged capacities to do all that stuff is the right way to think about it.
Right.
Because the enlarged capacity is really a bigger mind, bigger heart, bigger soul with which to take in all of God in all of the ways that he will reveal himself both now and then. So because eye has not seen, I need better eyes. Because ear has not heard, I'll need better ears. Because mind has not conceived, I'll need a better mind to conceive it. And so what will heavenly rewards look like? Better eyes, better mind, better ears, in order to see him and know him in all the ways that he'll reveal himself, world without end.
That sounds good.
Amen.
Amen. This book, it's funny, almost everything we just talked about is in here in some capacity and generally expounded upon more thoroughly. I really think that the book, if you're thinking about buying the book, it's $10 right out there, right? Mm-hmm. The book is a breath of fresh air to Bethlehem culture, I think, in some ways. I think it is honoring to everything that the foundation we've sat on, and is really a powerful help towards not only our horizontal culture, if you can talk about it like that, our relational culture, how we relate to things and people, but also our vertical culture, as we begin to put actual images and feet on the idea of the glory of God. I think one of the things that this book has done for me so clearly, so powerfully, is helped me to understand that there can be vague, indistinct pictures we have of the glory of God, and it's nebulous because we can be so vertical, so to speak, that the horizontal, when the horizontal is dismissed as, if all we do is the comparative approach and not the integrative approach, then what happens is our ideas of God become somewhat nebulous and not really founded on the beauty that he has put in front of us. So that's been it's just a powerful book, and I would encourage you guys to read it cover to cover. I think there's a lot of great stuff there's some stuff on the Trinity that will at least begin to knock your socks off, and I would encourage you to read it. Yeah. I'm really thankful for it.
Good.
Yeah. Thanks for all your answers.
For doing this. Yeah. Let me pray. Yeah. Father, thank you so much. We are grateful for this world that you've made. We want to receive all of you in it. And so, as Lewis says, every walk in a forest or in a cold Minnesota winter gives us bearings on the bright blur. We get our bearings. We can get oriented so that we can see and feel and know you as you refract yourself and your infinite splendor in all of these finite little bitty ways. And so we want to be alive to reality. We want to be alive to you and alive to this world. So grant us the grace to have open hearts, to receive it, to put you supreme in our affections, and to have a full love for you. And then from there to have that heart expanded as we enjoy the things of earth. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.